Solitaire Rose Radio, episode 32. I always wanted to change the world. One of the things I've always said about the Solitaire Rose Radio solo podcast I do is it's about stories. I'm telling the story of Jack Kirby, I'm telling the story of EC, I'm telling other stories that people send in, I'm doing interviews. But one of the things I haven't really touched on a lot in the podcast is that I like to write. I take part in the annual NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. I've done it the majority of the last, sweet Christmas, 14 years, where you, in the month of November, pledge to write a 50,000-word novel. And there was only one year I didn't succeed, and that was a year I knew I wouldn't succeed because I had way too many hours. Right after I got out of college, I was writing short stories, and I had incredibly limited success in selling them. I sold some text stories to some small press comic books that I doubt if anyone can find anymore. I don't even know how many were printed. I know I didn't get paid for it. When I was on the computer forum, this was before the World Wide Web, it was called Genie, and there were a number of publications that came out of that I had short stories in. But short stories seem to have fallen out of favor. You don't see a lot of short stories being published. When I was in school, there were tons of anthologies being published. There were science fiction anthologies, some of which came out annually, some of which came out every few months. Back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even, there were magazines that published short stories. If you look at a lot of Ray Bradbury stories that were in his so-called novels, which were really collections of short stories that he would write bridges for, many of those short stories originally appeared in science fiction magazines, Playboy. One of the most influential books of science fiction is a collection of short stories called Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison. But short stories seem to have fallen out of favor. The anthologies slowly went away. It's pretty rare to see any anymore, from a major publisher. There are some small press publishers that are still doing them. They don't pay a lot, if anything. The science fiction magazines that still exist have circulations of 10,000 issues or less. The only two places I know that still publish short stories in any way are Playboy, and you have to be a name writer, and The New Yorker. And The New Yorker has a certain style of short story that they publish. And because of this, I kind of didn't write short stories for a long, long time. But last year around Christmas, one of my pals that I met through Comic Geek Speak, on his blog wanted to do 12 stories of Christmas. And what it was, he wanted to put up 12 short stories. And they didn't have to be Christmas related. And he asked me, which kind of surprised me. I didn't even know he knew I wrote, but I said, sure. And I dug up one of my old short stories that I wrote for the web page back in prehistory, dusted it off, cleaned it up, gave it a quick polish, and gave it to him. And it really felt good. It felt good in a way that nothing else does. I'm not saying that I don't like doing the podcast, or I don't like writing the novels, or I don't like things that I do, but there was something about writing something and having it out immediately. Just that instant rush of a short story, a small piece of fiction out there. So this week, I had an idea come to me while I was at lunch, and I just wanted to write it down. So this is a first draft. It was written actually on legal pad paper. And I'll get around to typing it up in a few weeks and cleaning it up and polishing it. And then I don't know what I'm going to do with it, because really, nobody publishes short stories anymore. So the short story here is called I Always Wanted to Change the World. The difference between a rut and a groove is that you enjoy a groove. So by that measure, Dave Marshall was in a rut. He'd graduated college with a degree in graphic design, hustled to get a job, and ended up photo correcting for makeup ads. CoverGirl, the like, because that's important. And a few years of that and a couple of promotions got him to leading people who did photo corrections for the photos and makeup ads. In that time, he acquired a home, spouse, son, couple of awards, 50 extra pounds, and enough marketable skills to be hired by a rather large advertising firm. He settled into the production department's CGI wing, leading a team of similar people who made TV ads look appealing and bright so that the people who didn't speed through them on their TiVos might try the product. Changing the world one roll of toilet paper at a time. Every day he woke up at 6, left home at 7, worked from 8 till 5, spent the day either evaluating high-end CGI, creating project plans, or sitting in meetings with middle-aged chumps who all thought they were either Don Draper or his female equivalent. He'd get home, make supper on alternative days, and watch TV with his wife. Any desire he had to ever do, influential design work, or pure art, had been replaced by having a well-designed lawn and making sure the house looked nice. His dreams of changing the world had been replaced by dreams of a calm workdays, relaxing nights, and a feeling of comfort permeating his life. In June, the company found out it had won the bid to put together an ad for a major soft drink company. By September, the people above him had finished their work, and he was in a meeting with the head of creative, an IT guy he'd never seen before, his boss, and the VP in charge of his division. The head of creative was a fit, handsome, impeccably dressed man with gray hair, an angular face, perfect teeth, and just the right number of lines around his eyes to make you believe whatever he said. This story that we've created takes people through the storm and to the product, he began with an announcer's voice. The vice president in charge of his division was also an imposing man. He seemed to scowl when he wasn't leading the meeting, and he had a suit a U.S. senator would wear, especially on a TV appearance. It was hanging on his older frame, a little loose. What hair he had left was in a ring around his skull, and was a vision of what Dave would be in 20 years if he didn't screw up. Your department will be creating the weather effects over the raw footage, as well as making things look enticing, he said with clipped, demanding tone. His boss was 10 years younger than him and had the look of a 90s college professor in the MBA department. Slightly long brown hair with sideburns, a smug look, and an almost drowsy look in his eyes. However, he had much more education on the newest technology, so he'd beat Dave out for the job, and surprised everyone by not being a dick about it. We have to have our end done by Christmas break. I'll make sure to move resources so you can hit your deadlines, he said in his hypnotizing tone. The IT guy was the only one without a blazer and tie, mostly because he had this mistaken belief that he and his whole goddamn department could be outsourced to India the second an executive needed to find money for a new corporate jet. You will be using a brand new CGI software we created called Nam Icon. It renders more fully for the 4K TVs, and the IT guy went into detail so boring that Dave was unable to recall any more about what he said under penalty of execution. His boss filled him in on the training dates, said that he and his team would get full training, detailed training, and extensive training. That way they could use the software properly. The rest of the meeting was taken up by congratulating each other on the huge account they had won, mocking people who weren't in the room, and assorted business-related talk that kept them from getting back to their desks early. 2 weeks later, as Dave's team started work on the effects, he started to notice something strange. It was little things at first that just seemed odd. The software was huge. It was at least 5 times as big as their previous rendering software. He had to have IT allocate more shared drive space, which he normally had to fight for and wait a few months for, but it was available immediately with no question. That had never happened with any IT request. Ever. The rendered files themselves were large, larger than any he'd ever seen. When he would open them to make sure they were being handled correctly, there weren't any issues. They were just big. He worked with the IT guy to make sure that they were saving correctly, and the IT guy gave a quick, "Stop worrying about it," and changed the subject. Another odd thing happened a few weeks later when he was checking on his team of renderers. They were working on a newly finished segment, and one of the guys was just zoning out. He was zoning out in a way Dave had never seen before. The guy's name was Mark, and Mark's eyes were wide open with dilated pupils. The only part of his body that was moving was his mouse hand, continuing to refine the snowflakes on the screen. Dave tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Mark, you all right?" Mark didn't react. Dave shook him and said, "Mark, what's wrong?" In shaking his arm, he caused a huge error on the snowflake that made the program stop and freeze the screen. Mark's eyes returned to normal, and his skin was clammy, as if he'd just broken out in a cold sweat. He looked around, and he looked at Dave, and he asked, "What happened?" Dave looked at him and said, "You were zoning out, but your eyes were all weird. Are you okay?" "What do you mean?" Mark asked, clearly still confused. "Go walk it off. You've coded enough for now," Dave said. Mark actually went home. He was out for a couple of days after that for exhaustion and dehydration. It didn't make any sense, and it didn't get any better. In fact, it just got worse. Within a week, he'd taken to walking around the aisles every hour, and anyone who was starting to zone out, he would tap them on the shoulder and tell them they had to take a break. Obviously, this slowed them down. So in the October status meeting, he let the supervisory team know that because of this, deadlines were slipping, and he needed more frontline people to get back on track. As he was being told by his boss, the vice president, and the head of creative that it was utterly unacceptable, his mind drifted back to the first meeting wherein he was told he would have all available resources at his disposal. Dave smiled a bit at this wonderful fiction. As he listened to them take turns criticizing him, he looked busy, pretending to write down notes, when the IT guy interrupted them and said, "No, that's going to happen. Software is very advanced, and it has strobe effects that most people can't see, but it'll still mess them up. Get him some temps." Head of creative asked, "Strobe effects?" The IT guy said slowly and distinctly, "Strobe effects." The vice president huffed, "Fine," told the boss to get right on it. The boss said he wanted the paperwork to bring in the temps on his desk by the end of day. Head of creative glared at all of them, but especially the IT guy, and said nothing. There was no congratulation, no mocking, and no business-related talk. Everyone showed a distinct lack of caring about not getting back to their desks early. They brought in 10 temps. 5 washed out during the first 2 weeks. They struggled to keep up as the project got closer to the finish line, and many more breaks were needed the further along they went. The week before Thanksgiving, the breaks were no longer helping. It was so prevalent it was called locking up in the office. If someone started to show signs, everyone was empowered to shut down the computer and make the person take a walk. Dave was amazed that the IT guy was now his biggest advocate. Computer downtime, long breaks, more temps, all were met by glowering until the IT guy would send an email telling him it had to be approved. But that pre-Thanksgiving Monday night, Dave's curiosity overwhelmed him. Everything about this seemed wrong. There's no way software with strobe effects would affect this many people this strongly. There was no way things would slow down this much. When he was alone in his office after most people had left, he opened the software. Now, he opened the software every day, but this time he opened it and pulled up a frozen frame of one of the snowflakes. He expanded it on his screen so that it was full screen, and immediately felt something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put a finger on it. He just knew something was wrong. His stomach felt nauseous. The room felt cold, and he started to get lightheaded. He pushed through the feelings and kept looking at the snowflake till it seemed as if he could see tiny writing on it. He expanded it once again, and the feeling got worse. He adjusted the color, the contrast, and the other factors to try and see what the word was. As he kept messing with the picture, he started to realize The entire image was made up of that one word. He enlarged the image one more time, and finally, he could read the word. And as he did, the world went black. He didn't know how long it had been. He didn't know how long everything had been black. But as he looked around, he was filled with horror. He was outside, and the sky was pitch black. No stars, no moon, no outline of clouds. Just pure absence of light, except for the flashes of lightning, like he'd never seen before. When a flash would light up the sky, he could see the outline of something colossal, something moving, something destroying. The ground was sticky, and as he lifted his feet, there was a feeling that he was not supposed to do that. The air was filled with the smell that reminded him of rotten meat. His lungs burned as if he had been running for hours. The worst was the sound. The sound was so loud it was oppressive. It was like locusts, but worse. There was screaming. There was a horrible grinding noise, and a low hum that shook his insides and added to the feeling of nausea and dread. And above it all, somehow, was the word, over and over and over, in voices like insects. He knew this was how the world would end. Then it all went away. He was sitting at his desk, drenched in a cold sweat. 3 of his team members were there, and they asked the questions he'd written up to ask people when they would lock up. Are you okay? Yes. Do you need to take a break? Yes. Can I walk you to your car? No. He quietly answered them all, and then asked, do any of you remember what you saw while you were locked up? None of them did. Then again, he doubted anyone had dug that deep into the software to see that word in a way that they could make out. It was there, and they could sense it, but they couldn't read it. He'd read it. As his team members were leaving, the IT guy came in. Dave was astounded that the IT guy had just shown up in his office. He hadn't called the IT guy, but there he was. He looked even more slovenly, with his shirt untucked, dirty sneakers, and blue jeans, and it wasn't even Casual Friday. He glared at the people as they left the room, and when they were gone, he shut the door. He walked up to Dave's desk, his eyes dark, his face dour, and he said, what the hell did you do? And Dave told him. Dave told him the whole story. Told him everything he'd seen. Told him everything he'd done. He told him everything except what the word was, because he knew if he said the word, he would go back to that horrible, horrible place. The IT guy's expression didn't waver. He showed no surprise, and at the end, he simply asked, in a low, dead voice, and what are you going to do about this? We have to stop. Something's not right, Dave said. Are you sure about that? The IT guy asked, no change in his demeanor. You don't think we should? Dave said. If we show this ad with this word embedded, it'll be a disaster. Millions of people. This is the biggest television event of the year. Millions of people will see this. They will have the same vision. They will go into the same trance. We can't allow that to happen. And if they saw what I did, I'm shocked I got out of it with my sanity intact. Got it, the IT guy said. He then turned, opened the door, and 2 security guards came in and grabbed Dave. Dave struggled a little bit, but when they cuffed him, he knew it was over. They took him downstairs into a waiting ambulance. Dave was quickly escorted to a highly secured psychiatric wing of a local hospital. When he sat down with the intake doctor, he told the intake doctor the whole story. The doctor reacted by nodding and telling a nurse about a number of pills that Dave needed to take immediately. The next 2 months were a blur. His dreams were consumed by the visions he'd seen, and no matter how many pills they gave him at night, he would wake up every 2 hours screaming that the world was coming to an end. His wife and child visited a lot at first. His son was scared. Let's face it, psych ward is pretty scary on its own. But when your dad's there, it's even scarier. So, his son quit coming early on. After Christmas, his wife's visits were less frequent as well. He always ended each visit by warning her not to watch the Super Bowl and to make sure not to watch the ad. She always said yes with a look of sadness and pity. He didn't push it. He didn't obsess on it, because he knew if he did, she'd think he was crazier than he really was, and she wouldn't take it seriously as a warning. He would just say it as part of his goodbyes. I love you. I hope I'm home soon. And please don't watch that ad on the Super Bowl. The night of the game, they made it a big deal in the ward. A special meal was brought in. They had snacks. They never had snacks. They had decorations. Decorations were very nice. And all the evening groups were canceled so that people could watch the game. Dave was planning on staying in his room, but he was told that it was an important part of his therapy to confront his fears. To help him confront his fears that morning, 2 orderlies pulled him out of his room and locked the door so he couldn't get back in. As the game started, he moved as far away from the TV as he could and sat in a chair, staring out the window, making sure he couldn't see the reflection of the TV in the window. Outside it was a sunny, cold winter's day. Snow had fallen 2 days before, so most of it had been cleared, but it still blanketed the area. If it wasn't for the fact that he was in a psych ward, it would have been a very peaceful view. The sun was still up when the coin toss started. One of the younger nurses came over and stood beside him. She waited a beat, obviously planning what she was going to say. She'd had training. I don't care much for football either, she said, in a bland, comforting tone. Doug nodded. He was fighting the fear that threatened to consume him. He'd heard the first few notes of the music in the ad he'd worked on. He forced himself not to look in the direction of the TV and to make sure that there were no reflections that he could see. He did, however, see the nurse's eyes immediately go blank, pupils growing wide. He then turned and looked out the window and watched the light rapidly fade from the sky. Last thing he said was, I always wanted to be involved in changing the world. I know this was a different sort of episode, and I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for giving it a try. And as always, there are sponsors. Solitaire Rose Radio is brought to you by DreamHost.com. DreamHost.com is the best, bar none, web host in the whole known universe. If you need a web page, you can't do any better than DreamHost.com. And if you use the code CRAYZ, K-R-A-Y-Z, you get $20 off your first year. Do you like snacks? Do you like tasty snacks? Do you like tasty, healthy snacks? Of course you do. Go over to Graze.com and you can get healthy, tasty snacks delivered right to your door. If you use the code CORYS, 3R5P, your first and 5th box are free. And they've got all sorts of options. You could get them weekly. You could get them every other week. You could get them monthly. You could get a big box that's fit for sharing, or you could get a small box that's just for you, and you can hide it so nobody else has it. So use the code CORYS, 3R5P, that's C-O-R-Y-S, 3R5P, and your first and 5th boxes are free. I get amazing razors delivered from Dollar Shave Club for just a few bucks. Now I always shave with a fresh blade. Does that make me a genius? Of course it does. So if you want to try it, go to dollarshaveclub.com/crazy and give it a try. I've been using it for over 2 years, and it's wonderful. One thing I'd like to add is I interviewed one of my oldest friends. Well, my oldest friend other than Joe, really. Jen Wickett, a while back in November. She came up to visit for the convention. It was wonderful to see her. And the convention, well, it cost some money. So if you could go to her website, jimwicked.com, check over the stuff she's selling, see if there's some art you want to buy. I'd really appreciate it. Because of the convention, Joe and I didn't record a podcast last week, so you're going to get 2 solo podcasts. This is the first one, and it's a shorter one. And the one coming out later this week is Jack Kirby from 1972 to 1974. I hope you liked this. Please give me any feedback. Podcasts live on feedback. If you want to give feedback, please email me at cory.strode@gmail.com. If you're listening to this on YouTube, thank you. I really appreciate it. I just started putting the podcast up on YouTube as kind of an experiment. I want to see how it's going to go. If you'd like to buy advertising on the Solitaire Rose podcast or on Crazy Comics and Stories, you can. Just send me an email to cory.strode@gmail.com, subject advertising. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back with more stories.